Hey there, good morning everyone. I'm Errol Barnett in for our friend and neighbor Vladimir Duthiers. Right now we're watching all the news happening around the world. Here are some of the top stories we're following for you right now. Doctors are giving an update on Pope Francis's condition. He's waking up in the hospital for a 10th day in a row. This as prayers for his recovery are coming in from around the world. President Trump will meet with French President Emmanuel Macron on a day that marks 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and this comes as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's willing to give up his presidency in return for NATO membership for his country. And we will speak to a former IRS probationary employee who's been laid off as part of DOJ's cost-cutting efforts, what he's saying about the Trump administration's decision. This is CBS News 24/7. All right, let's start with this in Rome for you. Pope Francis remains in the hospital, resting at this hour after experiencing serious respiratory crisis over the weekend. Doctors are monitoring his diagnosis of mild kidney failure, but he's very delicate. This marks the pontiff's longest stay in hospital since he became the Pope. CBS News papal contributor Delia Gallagher is live now just outside Vatican City with more on the Pope's condition. Delia, what is the latest on how he's doing and what the expectation is for a full recovery?
Well, Errol, the Vatican tells us this morning that Pope Francis had a restful night. Not a whole lot of information in their morning bulletins, let's remember, but it's important information given the difficulties that you mentioned that the Pope experienced this weekend, a respiratory crisis, a bit of anemia, which required blood transfusions, and, of course, the initial beginnings of a mild renal insufficiency. All of those, by the way, Earl, the Vatican clarified on Sunday, have been put under control now. We know that the Pope is in good spirits. He was able to participate in Mass yesterday on the 10th floor of the Gemelli Hospital, where he's staying with some nurses and healthcare workers there. And we know that he was able also to thank people for all of their well wishes, sending out a tweet yesterday to express his thanks for the well wishes that have come in from around the world. Errol?
And all of this is so crucial because the Pope had said if he felt that he could not conduct his duties, he would step down. But what do we know about the care he's receiving? It's likely the best the world has to offer. But what specifically is being done to get him on the mend?
Well, absolutely. Look, his primary doctor is Dr. Sergio Alfieri. He's the man who operated on the Pope in 2023 for his intestinal difficulties. He gave a press conference on Friday and explained exactly what the difficult balance is in trying with an 88-year-old patient to find the right amount of drugs that aren't going to kick out one thing and cause another problem, such as we saw a little bit this weekend with the anemia and with the respiratory difficulties and so on. Now, he did not specify the types of drugs that he is giving the Pope, but he did say they are a lot. And on Friday, therefore, he said minimum a week's stay in the hospital. But, of course, that was before the difficulties now of this weekend, in which the hospital is saying prognosis is reserved. So they won't be saying exactly when the Pope will be able to come home.
And Delia, it's such an important time. You've got so many Catholics coming to Rome to get to the Vatican, usually during this Jubilee time, to see the Pope. They are still coming, but he's not there, of course. So how is the Vatican managing operations in his absence?
Well, look, Earl, the Vatican is no stranger to popes in hospital. This has happened many times throughout various pontificates. So the whole place keeps running. In fact, all of the Jubilee events are still on schedule and so forth. And the offices keep running. In fact, last week they told us that some of the Pope's closest collaborators were bringing the Pope documents and so forth to discuss. So the Vatican keeps going, as it were, and certainly for all of the pilgrims that are coming, all of the events are still happening. In fact, just behind me, they're setting up tonight for a special rosary. All of the cardinals in Rome are going to come to St. Peter's Square with all of the pilgrims here to say a special prayer tonight at 9 o'clock for the Pope. Errol?
All right, we hope he gets on the mend soon. Delia, thanks so much for the latest information. Thank you. Dozens of world leaders are in Kyiv today to mark 3 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. President Trump says he can end the war, but he's making big demands of Ukraine right now, which he recently blamed incorrectly for starting the conflict. Retired General H.R. McMaster spoke about Trump's efforts to secure a peace deal earlier on CBS Mornings.
So Putin plays Trump with, the prospects of a big deal, that he could be the peacemaker. He gives him his warped version of history. And so that's what you heard from Donald Trump. Those were all the Kremlin's talking points that you heard him roll out.
CBS News foreign correspondent MTS Taya brings us the latest from Ukraine.
Well, as Ukrainians reflect on the third anniversary of this brutal war, which has destroyed so many lives, you can see this building behind me, which was once a residential building. In fact, we talked to a woman who lived in this area, and she was in her home when Russia carried out the strike, which made all of this damage. And she said, now that she's living in temporary shelter, that she's hopeful the war will end, but doesn't know how it will, especially given the fact that we've seen President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky really trade broadsides with each other over the past week, and many questioning just how this war will end, especially now that Ukraine hasn't been invited to those talks between the U.S. and Russia as part of ways to try to figure out how to end this war. Whatever the case, we've heard from President Zelensky, who said that he would resign if it meant his country would be at peace and if it were able to be part of NATO. Now, that's the transatlantic military alliance that Russia is so bitterly against, and something the Trump administration has already said Ukraine likely won't join as part of any deal it makes with Moscow. Back to you.
MTS Tayeb, thank you for that. As world leaders meet in Kyiv today, French President Emmanuel Macron is meeting with President Trump at the White House at this moment. And the meeting comes after European powers were excluded from peace deal talks last week, you may remember. CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand joins us now from the White House with more on this. And Natalie, we for a while heard President Trump say he'd be able to end the war in Ukraine quickly. But how are we any closer to that happening today?
Yeah, Errol, good to be with you. Well, we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio last week, the president's Secretary of State, that really whether or not Russia is serious about ending this conflict remains to be seen. We'll see in the coming weeks. And as you noted, high-level meetings today between President Trump and the French president. They're on a leadership call with G7 leaders right now, which is still underway. The French president here right now as part of this push by European leaders to make sure that they and Ukraine are at the negotiating table and that Ukraine's interests are taken fully into account, as well, of course, as its security. There has been concern expressed by European allies that these talks between the U.S. and Russia could lead to a less favorable outcome for Ukraine. So obviously, European allies who are concerned about Europe's larger safety here to try to make that case today. The Trump administration and the president, for that matter, stressed that, the U.S. is talking to not only Russia, but its European allies and Ukraine as well.
And we heard from the French president that he, of course, is advocating for Ukraine to be a part of whatever discussions happen to bring peace and create a next phase. And we know that President Trump is meeting with other world leaders this week. I'm curious what Trump wants from them or what he wants to accomplish from these other meetings.
Right. As you noted, the British Prime Minister will be coming here later this week. The French president here now. We're very eager to see what he has to say following this initial meeting with the president. We know that they will have a joint news conference later today. So all ears will be attuned to what happens there. But we know that the U.S., the Trump administration, has been pushing Ukraine to try to give the U.S. access to some rare earth minerals as part of this larger negotiation. We know that the president has repeated that point on multiple occasions, including over the weekend, speaking about this conflict during CPAC. During his remarks there. So we know that that is likely to be part of these talks, again, as the president tries to put pressure on both sides to end the war that Russia started 3 years ago.
Yeah, and I think we do expect a press conference between the U.S. and French president at approximately 2 p.m. Eastern, so we'll see what gets answered there. You and I were speaking earlier this morning on the CBS Morning News about these DOGE cuts to so many agencies, telling people to reply with what they've been up to, otherwise they will be considered resigning. But some agencies telling their staff not to comply. Fill us in on that.
Yeah, we're seeing some really interesting and notable pushback from some of the agency heads, secretaries of these departments saying don't respond to that email, that there's a process internally at these departments for employee reviews and that it shouldn't be coming from the Office of Personnel Management. Among some of the agencies that were pushing back, the president's own newly confirmed FBI director, Kash Patel, as well as the Department of Defense and the State Department, again, telling employees not to respond to that email listing 5 or so accomplishments over the past week. Some labor employment attorneys have also said that those emails may not even be legal. So already heading into this new week, we are seeing a notable pushback by some of these departments as the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, continue to look for ways to make cuts to the federal workforce.
All right, Natalie Brand with all the latest for us from the White House. Natalie, thank you very much. Now, President Trump has named Air Force Lieutenant General Dan Kane to be his next pick as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On Friday, the president announced he was firing this man, the current chairman, Air Force General Charles Q. Brown. The new defense secretary also announced the firings of other top brass, which included the chief of naval operations, Lisa Franchetti. Let's bring in senior national security correspondent Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon for us. Charlie, why dismiss the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, such a crucial position at this time?
Well, Errol, I guess you'll have to ask the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. I can tell you that, I mean, he didn't give any reason. He actually applauded both individuals that you mentioned there, Admiral Lisa Franchetti and General C.Q. Brown, for their service. Said that General Brown was distinguished. He had worked with him. Remember, he's been working here for a few weeks with right beside General C.Q. Brown. I think what's important to note here, too, is that role, that chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is intentionally designed to carry over to administration. So General Brown was supposed to, his term would have finished in 2027, so it's kind of cut off. And the whole idea is to maintain that sort of continuity, because that position is the linchpin, the highest military officer inside the building, the highest military officer answering to the president, advising the president, and advising the defense secretary. So not only is that person responsible for the execution of policy, but also there to take a good read of what's going on all over the world, feed that information into the defense secretary and to the president himself. Why it's happened? Secretary Hegseth has actually pointed out and actually name-checked General C.Q. Brown as being too woke, being obsessed with DEI programs. And General Brown, you know, makes no apologies for that. He had been actively driving those DEI programs. In fact, Secretary Hegseth went a bit further to say that he himself may have been DEI hire, along with Lisa Franchetti, you know, the first CNO, the first chief of naval operations, a female chief of naval operations, suggesting that she too might have been a DEI hire. So these are two major roles, two of the highest roles, well, the highest role in terms of military terms. And then look at where U.S. troops are deployed. C.Q. Brown just came back from the border.
Replaced by someone of a lower rank. I want to ask you, Charlie, about the possibility of additional cuts to Defense Department staff. What do we know today?
Yeah, you know, Errol, like every other federal organization, it's been a roller coaster. Last week, I think it was Friday morning, we woke up and we were told like there'd be maybe 40, 50,000 or more cuts. That was kind of based on an order that went out to find between 5 and 8% of civilian personnel throughout the DOD to cut back. And it was aiming at people who were on probation. That would have been easiest. Then they pulled that right back. And that happened on Friday afternoon. They said, well, wait a minute. Okay, this is going to be complicated, aside from the fact that it might actually have an impact on military readiness. And under Title 10, each one of those cases has got to be reviewed by the Secretary. So 50,000 cases is going to take some time. Instead, they pushed that back to about 5,400. That's the number they gave us. That will happen this week. But they haven't cut off the ambition to take between 5 and 8% of the civilian military personnel. They're just figuring it's going to take more time to execute that.
Significant cuts, and it impacts people all across the country, not just there near the nation's capital. And as we've been reporting, Charlie, it's been 3 years now since the start of the war in Ukraine. You've covered it extensively, and we actually remember the moment from your reporting a few days into the fighting. Let's just share this with our viewers.
What happened? What the hell was that?
Whoa.
I get chills looking back at that. I'm just wondering, you were there and you've done so much of important reporting in dangerous places. What do you think as you look back to that?
Well, first of all, that is a good lesson in what not to do if you're covering conflicts. When you see a bright light, get away from the windows. Don't get any closer to it. But I remember that happened. That was an incoming missile that was intercepted. So the first light that you saw was the explosion, the intercept itself. The second, much larger one that was close to us, and you hear that huge explosion, was the missile coming in and exploding once it hit the ground. It hit a bus station. Nobody was hurt, thank goodness. So I guess we can laugh about it now. But I remember at the time that Kyiv itself was under siege. You know, my colleagues and I were saying, we're probably here for a lock-in. You know, the Russians had got to within 20 miles from the capital. We went up to Bucha, extremely dangerous area. You know, several Ukrainians were killed. We saw the tanks for ourselves. They were coming down the street. We came under attack. And then they were thinking, there were even people in D.C. said this might be over in 3 days, 3 weeks, that Kyiv itself would fall. And then we saw the pushback. But all the names that we now know, right? We went out to Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia was under attack. Dnipro was under attack. Kyiv itself was under attack. And the Ukrainians were losing ground. And they fought bravely because they didn't have anywhere near the kind of equipment, part of that U.S. supplied equipment, mostly artillery, which was needed at the time. Then the tanks came in. I remember when the first anti-tank weapons came in to stop the Russians. But the Russians were very close. They were closing in on two sides, and they got to within 20 miles, well, driving distance to the capital itself. They have fought back, but it has been a grind. I mean, I can't believe it's been 3 years of really ferocious fighting. You know, when we use the word stalemate, it gives you the impression that, you know, it's stopped. It's not. The stalemate is vicious. They're attacking each other, have been throughout the winter, gaining little ground. One day you'll hear one town has fallen or a village has fallen. The other one's been taken back. And that is where we are right now. We may be looking at a political breakthrough. Obviously, we've all been watching very closely. The Ukrainians themselves say, we're the first to say we want to stop the fighting there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charlie, so much. And there were more Russian drone attacks on Kyiv overnight, so just a non-stop onslaught on the Ukrainian people now for 3 years. We appreciate your reporting, as always.
Thanks, Errol.
Coming up next, a CBS News exclusive. The Trump administration is looking to bring back a pandemic-era policy as part of its efforts to enforce the southern border. Next, why the White House is justifying its return. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. Hamas is warning it will not hold talks on the next steps of the Gaza ceasefire agreement until Israel releases Palestinian prisoners as agreed. Now, Israel paused their release, complaining about how released hostages were treated as they were returned to Israel. Phase 1 of the deal is set to expire this week, and this comes as Israel's military is stepping up operations in the West Bank. CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Patta brings us more.
Good morning. Israeli tanks have moved into the occupied West Bank for the first time in over 2 decades. Israel says it is to stamp out militancy. Palestinian authorities called it a dangerous escalation. The military operation comes amidst fears that the fragile Gaza ceasefire, set to expire by the end of the week, will not be extended. The last living Israeli hostages to be freed as part of the 6-week truce were reunited with loved ones over the weekend. But in Gaza, families waited in vain after Israel said it had delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners until Hamas stops what it calls its humiliating hostage handovers. Hamas now says it will not engage in any further negotiations until the prisoners are handed over. Families of captives still in Gaza are insisting talks must continue. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was heckled during a military graduation on Sunday, accused of abandoning Cherie Bibas and her 2 boys after their bodies were finally brought home for burial. U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East Steve Witkoff arrives in the region later this week in a bid to ensure the ceasefire holds for a second phase. Back to you.
All right, Deborah, thank you, reporting from the West Bank. Now to a CBS News exclusive. The Trump administration is preparing to bring back a pandemic-era immigration policy known as Title 42. Now, this allowed officials to expel migrants to prevent the spread of diseases. Let's bring in CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camila Montoya Galvez, who is in El Paso, Texas. Camila, remind us exactly what Title 42 is and how it functions.
Good morning, Errol. Title 42 is a public health authority dating back to the 1940s that the Trump and Biden administrations argued allowed U.S. immigration officials to quickly expel migrants here at the U.S.-Mexico border without allowing them to request asylum, which is traditionally a right that migrants have if they are here on American soil under domestic and international refugee law. But both administrations argued that this public health authority allowed the U.S. to essentially suspend the U.S. immigration and asylum law. Obviously, at the outset of the pandemic, the Trump administration enacted this measure, and then it was kept in place for a while by the Biden administration until it expired in 2023, rather. And now officials are planning to reinstate that policy, this time, Errol, citing concerns that migrants could spread communicable diseases like tuberculosis in the U.S. Obviously, during the first time, it cited COVID concerns. So it would add yet another layer to sweeping policies that the administration has enacted here at the border to essentially shut down the American asylum system.
And as you accurately know, Camilo, you got both Republican and Democratic presidents who've used this Title 42 in some way, justifying it differently. And you mentioned the Trump administration justifying it because of a new threat. Do we know anything about the data, how common it is that migrants looking for asylum actually have these types of diseases?
It is really unclear, and it will almost certainly be contested by public health experts. And we should underscore, Errol, that during the 2020 implementation of Title 42, CDC experts strongly oppose invoking this law on public health grounds, saying that it was a way for the Trump administration to essentially weaponize a public health law to achieve its immigration crackdown goals. And we should expect similar arguments from public health officials. Again, yes, TB rates in Mexico and other countries that send migrants to the U.S. border are typically higher than in the U.S., but they say that migrants typically are not vectors of diseases compared to the overall U.S. population. So this policy will not only be contested on legal grounds, Errol, but also on public health grounds.
Yeah, really important information and fact checks there for us. Camila Montoya Galvez in El Paso. Thank you so much. All right, thousands of staffers at USAID right now, they're on administrative leave. That's this morning as the Trump administration targets the organization as part of its widespread cost cutting. The impact it could have here in the U.S. and overseas next. Stay right there. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. A warm welcome back to CBS News 24/7. Here's a look at the big stories we're tracking for you right now. Authorities in Pennsylvania are working to find out why a man opened fire inside a hospital. This is in Harrisburg. Officials say the gunman knew someone who was recently in the hospital and targeted the intensive care unit. The shooter took some workers hostage in the ICU before he was eventually killed in a shootout with police. One police officer was killed and 5 others were injured. Jury selection begins today in the trial for a man charged with killing 7 people at a parade in Illinois back in 2022. Prosecutors say the suspect opened fire at a parade in Highland Park, that's just north of Chicago. The alleged shooter turned down a plea deal last year. The trial is expected to last 4 to 6 weeks. And former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy is expected to announce today that he's running for governor of Ohio. The former presidential candidate and co-head of the Department of Government Efficiency teased a big announcement for later this afternoon on the X platform. Current GOP Governor Mike DeWine cannot run for a 3rd term in 2026. All right, thousands of USAID employees are officially on administrative leave as of this morning, and it follows a judge's decision Friday to uphold President Trump's cuts to the agency. CBS News has learned support teams have now been set up to help staffers and their families return home safely from overseas. CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi joins us live from our Washington bureau with more on this. Olivia, we've spoken about how for many of these people, they now have to uproot their lives and get back home. Help us understand how all of this came about and which employees are impacted and shuffling their lives as we speak.
Yeah, Errol, it's good to be with you. A lot of new information we're learning about this over the weekend. So we know that all but just a selective few number of people who work at USAID have been placed on administrative leave. This happened as of last night at 11:59 p.m. And we can report that this may impact possibly about 4,200 employees of USAID. There are about 10,000 employees that do work there. But just to walk through exactly how we got here, we know that this organization was a target of Doge, Elon Musk, and the Trump administration to reduce what they're calling waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, and cutting back really on these grants and the money that gets spent on what would be humanitarian aid or soft power across the world. So they were in that line of sight for Elon Musk, and they tried to put all of these employees on administrative leave several weeks ago. A federal judge, actually a Trump appointee, blocked that, put a temporary pause on that, and then he allowed that temporary pause to expire on Friday. That is why we're seeing all of these emails coming to these employees, letting them know that they are being put on leave, that their services are no longer needed at USAID. We can also report, per that email, that approximately 2,000 personnel in duty stations across the U.S. will also be subject to this reduction in force. So this is impacting not only work abroad, but here in the U.S. and humanitarian impacts really across the board.
Yeah, and Olivia, I saw some footage over the weekend of some staffers at the USAID building in Washington, D.C., literally walking out the door with their possessions in boxes as they, leave. You can't imagine what it's like to go through something like that. What has the reaction been to these particular cuts now that they are official and this is real?
Well, this is going to have global ramifications. We do know that. Obviously, USAID has had a long history of that humanitarian power that we've used in various different countries in providing them aid and assistance, food, educational efforts, things of that sort. So about 2 of the 12 largest NGO recipients of USAID funds are actually Catholic charities, Catholic Relief Services and World Vision, and they provide food, water, healthcare services to people all across the world and in healthcare zones. And Catholic Relief Services, as a result of this, said that they can expect a drastic cut in work personnel that will be working on these sorts of projects across the world. And this is an organization that has been around since 1943 doing this kind of work. So it's really transformational in how the U.S. Will be working in several countries, not only as far as humanitarian power, but really our outreach to people and being able to help them and provide this humanitarian assistance. It's going to have a real world impact that we're just starting to see the impacts of now.
It's a very good point. I was just speaking with someone in Odessa, Ukraine, who said the same thing about USAID resources evaporating all of a sudden. A massive impact. Olivia, we appreciate your reporting, updating us on it all. All right, voters have begun expressing their frustration over the president's sweeping cuts across the federal government at town hall meetings in multiple states. And while anger among some Democrats is something you may expect, some Republican voters have been turning up to let their local lawmakers know they're unhappy. CBS News congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us now live from Capitol Hill with more on this. Caitlin, where is this happening and who is the frustration coming from that you've been able to tell so far?
Yeah, Errol, we started to see this late last week in some districts across the country. There was a big highlight in a very Republican district outside of Atlanta where Congressman Rich McCormick was really getting a lot of heated questions from constituents. Now, many of them were Democrats, but still, this is a very Republican district nonetheless. We also saw districts across the country get some pointed questions at town halls. And then just by and large, we've been talking to lawmakers up here on Capitol Hill who say that they've been getting a lot of questions from their constituents as well. And it is very early days, Errol, I will caution, but you have some questions about what this could become. Remember, in 2010, we started to see the fervor of the Tea Party really start at these town hall meetings. We saw a similar kind of situation in 2018. So it's early, but this is where you start to see constituent response. The bigger picture up here, Errol, is that you have this really interesting conflict, but a long-standing one, which is that you have Republicans on here, up here, interested in cutting the federal government, but they also have special interests at home. A lot of these agencies have, home bases essentially in some of these states, and there is broad concern among Republicans about what those kinds of cuts would do to industries and, particular areas in their states, even if they support the larger mandate to cut the federal government.
It's really interesting, Caitlin, and you know better than anybody as you followed candidate Trump as he was crisscrossing the country, that he really tapped into something voters wanted as far as reducing the federal government and cutting waste. And so I'm curious about the disconnect between Donald Trump following through on what he said he would do and some people in Republican districts complaining about it. Are there specific cuts that they're saying really get under their skin, or is there something else at play here?
Yeah, Errol, it's an interesting dynamic because you can be kind of broadly supportive, of course, of cuts to the federal government, but when it hits you directly, that may be a different story. Now, we're not seeing this yet at a fever pitch by any means, but it is we are starting to see kind of the beginning phases of this. And Errol, beyond this, what I'm really watching for up here on Capitol Hill, at least, is the conversation around the Republican budget. The House is expected to start to pass their budget legislation this week, and they are talking about deep cuts to spending, and programs like Medicaid could be on the chopping block. And you have Republicans in some districts who are concerned about that as well. So you have this kind of confluence of events where cuts to federal agencies, potential cuts to government programs. What does that do to constituents across the country, even in Republican districts? That is a big item and issue we're going to be watching.
Yeah, and we always say people should make their voices heard to their local representatives, but if you're concerned about a program where you live, now is the time to speak up. Caitlin Huey-Burns, live from Capitol Hill, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We turn our attention to Germany now, where early results show mainstream conservatives, led by Friedrich Merz, have the largest number of seats in Germany's brand new parliament. But the election has also shown a surge in support for the country's far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD party. CBS News senior foreign correspondent brings us more from Berlin.
This is the AfD's best result in a national election. They're on course to win about 20% of the vote since the far-right party was established just 12 years ago. During the campaign, the party's leader, Alice Weidel, pledged the mass deportation of immigrants. That's popular with some voters here in Germany who believe their country has taken in too many too quickly, and their frustration has been fueled by a series of violent attacks carried out by asylum seekers. Germany's stagnant economy may also also have helped the AfD at the polls. But many Germans are outraged by the rise of the far right. Their country famously has spent decades confronting its Nazi history. One of the AfD's regional leaders used a Nazi slogan at campaign events. German intelligence has placed the party under surveillance for suspected extremism. And Germany's mainstream parties have formed a pact vowing not to form a governing coalition with the AfD. Despite that, this month in Germany, Vice President J.D. Vance met with the AfD's leader, reportedly in a hotel basement. In a speech, Vance also urged Europe to stop isolating far-right parties. Elon Musk has gone further and publicly endorsed the AfD, even making a virtual appearance at a campaign event and saying, quote, "I think you're really the best hope for Germany." The pressure is now on Germany's mainstream parties to negotiate a coalition. If they cannot govern successfully, that could further drive up support for the AfD. Back to you.
Holly, thank you for that. Parts of northern New York State have been hit with several feet of lake-effect snow that damaged homes, and as you see here, it made travel just extremely difficult. This video is from Oswego County, which has seen between 5 and 6 feet of snow in the last 2 weeks alone. The county has seen more than 50% of its average total seasonal snowfall within weeks, with weeks of winter still left. So maybe there's more to come. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Kate Bilo for a look at our national weather. Kate, how does it look?
Errol, the good news is things are improving across the Northeast and really much of the country, all except for the Northwest, where that atmospheric river is still set up. But let's take a look at our globe here. I want to pull up the whole globe and show you basically the temperatures in the coming days. And what we're looking at is a return to milder weather. The polar vortex, that Arctic air, that purple you see, stays pretty locked up to the north all the way through the week and into the weekend. And that is going to allow portions of the plains, the Northeast and the Midwest to finally start to warm up a little bit and hopefully kind of reduce the threat for any additional lake effect snowfall. Let's talk about what to expect as far as temperatures are concerned. The temperature trends are going in the right direction. We're looking at temps above over the next several days. And in some spots, like take a look, for example, at Omaha, we're looking at 60 degrees today. That is 10 degrees above average. Right up into portions of Minnesota, Wisconsin, you're looking at temperatures 10 to 15 degrees above the norm. More of that tomorrow. All of this warmth spreading across the country's midsection and eventually into the Northeast as well. New York City, 55 tomorrow. That is 6 degrees above the average, and it just keeps on coming all week long. Temperatures are going to be above normal, basically from the deep south right on up into the Great Lakes, and we're going to see that trend continue even into the weekend. So some good news as we finish out what has been kind of a brutal month of February for much of the United States. And you can see we're kind of shutting off the lake effect snow machines as well with more of a southwest flow here over the next few days, drawing in that warm, moist air. Shifting gears to the West Coast, this is where they cannot catch a break. More rain, mountain snow, and strong gusty winds on the way. Let's take a look. As we go through today and into tonight, you can see snow breaking out across the Cascades, very heavy rain, and very, very strong winds as well. We have an excessive rain outlook all up and down the coast of Washington and Oregon. Errol, I'll send it back to you.
And that's saying something in a place that gets a lot of rain. Kate Bilo, thanks so much. We'll see you again soon. Last week, the IRS cut thousands of probationary workers as the federal government trims the workforce of multiple agencies, as we've been reporting. Well, coming up next, we'll speak to a former employee who was part of these cuts. We'll see how he's doing now. Next, you're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. The job cuts President Trump ordered at the IRS has many Americans wondering if it could lead to delays this tax filing season. More than 6,000 staffers were expected to be let go last week, and our next guest, unfortunately, counts himself among them. I want to bring in Jonathan Curry. He worked as a national media relations specialist with the IRS out of the D.C. headquarters. That was until last week. Tell us, I think you had just started in March of 2024. When did you get the sense that your job might be in jeopardy?
Yeah, thank you for having me. You know, I was about 3 weeks shy of my 1-year mark, so I was still in my probationary period. About a week and a half ago is when it was announced that instead of doing targeted layoffs of probationary employees, they were going to do widespread, indiscriminate layoffs. And at that point, up to that point, I had been hoping, kind of hoping that I'd be able to squeak through. I had been, integrated into the organization. I had worked well with my chain of command, and so I knew that they wanted to keep me on. So about a week and a half ago is when I found out that it probably wasn't going to happen. For the next couple of days, I was left in limbo, kind of wondering, checking my phone all President's Day weekend, wondering, am I going to have an email saying you've been terminated? And still nothing. By Tuesday, showed up in the office, still nothing. And then finally on Wednesday is when I got the notice. Had a conversation with my manager, and she was very brief. She told me, she was like, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but you need to report to the office tomorrow and bring in all your IRS equipment because you're being terminated.
Jonathan, it's tough to hear you recount what must have been so difficult and anxiety-inducing to experience, but I'm wondering, take us inside the IRS, what it's like in the offices, what it was like with your colleagues there, and how it feels to be described by the president as a component of government waste. So now that you're not doing your job, what does that mean as far as what's not being done at the IRS?
Yeah, so I worked with national media. We would be, taking in inbounds, taking in requests from reporters. They have questions. They want to know what's going on inside the IRS, or they want to know about some operation. We would be arranging interviews with between top officials and the press, and all of that would, communicate, what's going on and bringing transparency to our operations. So when you take away the employees that facilitate that, you hinder that operation. It was a large organization. The IRS had, I should say, they had about 100,000 employees up until the recent layoffs, and in any organization that large, you're always going to have some areas where you can improve efficiencies, you can make things more effective. But the IRS has always been subject to a lot of oversight, and I think that's oftentimes missing in the conversation. There's every federal agency has an inspector general. For the IRS, it was the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. There's the GAO, Government Accountability Office, Congressional Research Service, the tax writing committees, House Ways and Means Committee, Senate Finance Committee, and also the press. I was a former member of the press for about 10 years, and I know I used to scour for any kind of tidbit I could find about the IRS's operations to write a story. So there was plenty of oversight to begin with, and to look for those kinds of improvements. Another thing I want to add too, within my office, there were 4 of us that worked with for the main point of contact for national media. One of them was a probationary employee like myself, and we were both let go. 2 of them had been there for decades, and they were just incredible sources of institutional knowledge. I mean, they knew the processes, they knew all the points of contact within the organization, they had so much experience, and they were great mentors to myself and the other, but they're also going to be retiring the next 2 or 3 years. And so with the new people gone like myself, along with the old, the retiring ones on the way out, there could be a bit of a gap there.
Well, Jonathan Curry, we appreciate you.
That effect is going to be multiplied.
Yeah, we appreciate you sharing your story and you're noting that it's not just probationary employees, but folks retiring who will need to rely on newer folks coming in at some point. Thanks for sharing your story. All the best as you look for employment. Thank you for joining us. We do have much more news right ahead. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. All right, we've got this unfortunate news just into our newsroom. Grammy-winning singer and pianist Roberta Flack has died at the age of 88. She was diagnosed with ALS back in 2022, and of course, she was well known for her vocal and musical style on the hits Killing Me Softly with his song, The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face, and many others. Throughout her career, she had a total of 6 top 10 pop hits and 10 top 10 R&B singles. Her publicist said she died today surrounded by family. Our condolences to her family. Hollywood's biggest stars of the big and small screen gathered in Los Angeles last night at the SAG Awards. Timothy Chalamet took home the award for Outstanding Performance by a male actor in a leading role for his portrayal of the musician Bob Dylan in the movie A Complete Unknown. And Demi Moore took home the top award for a female actor for her performance in The Substance. The Oscars are next up for award season and will air this Sunday. Some say this may predict who will win then. All right, let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Kate Bilo with the last look at the national forecast. How's it looking, Kate?
You know, it's not too bad out there today, Errol. We've got some pretty quiet weather across much of the nation, all except for the Northwest, where another atmospheric river is bringing wind and rain. You can see conditions today, rain clearing out of Florida. We've got pretty quiet and mild conditions with 60s and 70s across the central and northern plains. But again, wind, rain and mountain snow impacting the Northwest, and that will continue for the next couple of days. Errol, I'll send it back to you.
All right, Kate Bilo, thanks so much. Have a great day. I'll see everyone tomorrow at 7 a.m. for the CBS Morning News. Next, Mugo Odigwe is live from San Francisco with all the breaking news coast to coast. This is CBS News 24/7.